The laughter echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the marble walls like a twisted symphony of injustice. Two men stood in the defendant's box, hands cuffed, shoulders squared, their dark eyes locked onto the two uniformed officers sitting across the room, smirking like they had already won. The weight of the accusation, the cold steel around their wrists, the way the world looked at them, as if they were already guilty, pressed down on them like a crushing tide. The air was thick with judgment, and the jury's eyes bore into them, scanning their every movement, waiting for one wrong twitch to justify the words that had already been spoken against them. One of the officers leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before. "They always think they're different," he muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a cruel grin. "Always think they're gonna outsmart the system. But the system don't change for people like them." The other officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Two brothers in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Classic. You know how many times we've seen this? It's always the same damn story. First, they beg. Then, they cry. And by the time they realize they never had a chance, it's already too late." A few quiet snickers rippled through the room, not from the jury, but from the prosecution table. The defense attorney sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his hands tight on the table as if he could strangle the injustice out of the air. But he knew. Everyone in that room knew. The verdict had been decided long before the trial had even begun. One of the brothers exhaled sharply, a breath so controlled, so measured, that it was almost chilling. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't look at the jury. His gaze was locked on the judge, on the one person in that room who had the power to determine their fate. The other brother shifted slightly beside him, the corner of his mouth twitching, not in fear, not in anger, but in something dangerously close to amusement. The judge, an older man with deep lines carved into his face from years of delivering verdicts, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was supposed to be impartial, but even he had let the prejudices seep into his bones. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low, serious. "You have been accused of assaulting an officer of the law. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The testimonies provided are clear. Do you have anything to say before I make my ruling?" The courtroom went silent. It was the moment of reckoning. The moment where every unfair trial in history had reached its inevitable conclusion. The moment where two more black men would be swallowed by a system that was never built for them to win. The smirking officer crossed his arms, waiting for the usual script to play out, the stammering, the desperate pleas, the final acceptance of their fate. Instead, the older brother tilted his head slightly, as if finally acknowledging the officers for the first time. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Too calm. "You made a mistake." The officer's smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me," he said, leaning forward. "You made a mistake," the younger brother repeated, his voice just as steady. "You picked the wrong men to frame." The silence in the room deepened. The energy shifted, subtle but undeniable. The laughter had stopped. The smirks had faded. Even the jury sat up a little straighter, as if sensing, too late, that something was off. The judge frowned. "I'd advise you to choose your next words carefully." The older brother smiled then. Not the smile of a desperate man clinging to false hope. Not the smile of someone trying to talk their way out of a losing battle. No, it was something else entirely. Something colder. Sharper. "We don't have to say anything," he said, his voice almost lazy. "Because the real evidence is already in play." The officers exchanged glances, confusion flickering in their eyes. The prosecution shifted uneasily. The judge leaned forward, suddenly more interested than he had been this entire trial. And then it happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the sound of polished shoes striking the floor filled the silence. A group of men and women in dark suits stepped in, their expressions unreadable, their movements precise. They didn't take a seat. They didn't hesitate. They simply walked forward, stopping only when they reached the edge of the prosecution's table. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp gaze, pulled a badge from his pocket and held it up for the room to see. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This trial is over." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The officers shot to their feet, their cocky expressions twisting into something close to panic. "What the hell is this?" one of them barked, turning toward the judge as if expecting him to fix this, to make it go away like he had so many times before. But the judge wasn't looking at them anymore. His eyes were locked on the two brothers, his face suddenly drained of color. Because he understood. He understood that these men weren't just ordinary defendants. He understood that every word, every step, every moment of this trial had been carefully orchestrated. That the brothers had never been desperate. Never been scared. They had been waiting. The older brother reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something that made both officers freeze in place. A badge. An FBI badge. The smirk returned to his face, slow, deliberate. He turned it over between his fingers, watching as the truth finally crashed down on the corrupt officers like a tidal wave. "You framed the wrong men," he said quietly. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The officers lunged for their weapons, but the federal agents were already moving. Handcuffs snapped into place. Rights were read. The same system that had been used to destroy innocent lives was now turning on the very people who had abused it for years. And the brothers? They stood there, free, watching as the ones who had laughed at them, the ones who had mocked them, were dragged away in cuffs. Because justice had finally found its way home. And the real verdict? It was just getting started. Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to say something important. At Plow of Twist, we stand against all forms of racism and injustice. We believe in fairness, truth, and giving a voice to those who have been silenced for too long. If you've ever faced discrimination, know that you are seen, heard, and valued. This channel is a place where justice always finds a way, and where the underdog gets the victory they deserve. Now, get ready for an emotional and intense ride. Enjoy the story. And don't forget to subscribe for more twists that will leave you speechless. The city of Atlanta had always carried two faces. The polished skyline with its towering glass buildings and bustling corporate offices reflected ambition and success, but just beneath its surface lay a world dictated by power, corruption, and unspoken rules. It was in this world that Malcolm and Elijah Carter had grown up. Two brothers, bonded by blood and by a past that had shaped them into men who saw the cracks in the system long before they ever had the power to do anything about it. Malcolm, the older of the two, had always been the steady force. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp gaze that rarely betrayed his emotions, he had learned from an early age that the world didn't give second chances to men like him. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of understanding that being right didn't always mean winning. His voice was measured, his words precise, never wasted. He had the kind of presence that made people stop and listen, even if they didn't want to. Elijah, younger by 3 years, had the same fire, but he let it burn closer to the surface. Where Malcolm was reserved, Elijah was intense, unfiltered, unafraid to challenge authority. He had never mastered the art of swallowing his anger, and the scars of his past encounters with prejudice, with injustice, had only made him fight harder. He wasn't reckless, he was just done playing by rules that had never been meant for him in the first place. They had both worked their way through the system the hard way. No shortcuts. No favors. Just persistence, intelligence, and an unwillingness to be beaten down. Their mother, a schoolteacher who had fought tooth and nail to give them a life where they could dream beyond survival, had instilled in them an understanding of two realities, the one written in laws and books, and the one that played out in streets and courtrooms. The latter was the one that mattered, the one that could decide whether a man walked free or disappeared behind bars for the rest of his life. Becoming FBI agents had never been about power. It had been about protection, about control, about making sure no one else had to suffer what they had seen their own people go through time and time again. It was about exposing the rot beneath the surface, the part that the world pretended wasn't there. And they had been good at it, damn good. Their ability to blend in, to move through spaces where they weren't expected to belong, had made them invaluable assets. They had spent years dismantling operations, taking down traffickers, exposing dirty money, but the one thing they had never expected was to be the ones framed. It had started with a single night, a routine drive through the city, the kind they had taken 100 times before. They weren't on duty. They weren't investigating anything. They were just two black men driving home, a simple fact that, in itself, had always been enough to put a target on their backs. They had seen the flashing lights in the rearview mirror, felt the familiar tension settle in their bones, the same tension that had existed since childhood. Even with badges in their pockets, even with the knowledge that they had earned their place in the very system that was supposed to protect them, they knew the drill. Hands on the dashboard. No sudden movements. Yes, officer. No, officer. But that night had been different. The cops had already decided who they were before they even rolled down the window. Officer Darren Watts and Officer Greg Miller, two names that would soon become seared into their memories, had approached with the same smug authority they had probably used on hundreds of others before them. It had started with a demand for IDs, then a supposed mistake in their registration, then the accusation, one so absurd that Malcolm had actually laughed before realizing they weren't playing. A report of two black men matching their description assaulting an officer in a nearby bar. No evidence. No victims. Just two cops who had decided their night was about to get a whole lot easier by pinning it on the first people they found. Malcolm had kept his composure. He always did. Elijah, though, he had seen this too many times to stay silent. He had demanded answers, questioned the officers, made it clear that they were being profiled, targeted, used as pawns in a game that had been rigged from the start. And that was all it had taken. The next moments had been a blur of aggression, of hands pulling them from the car, of rough voices barking orders, of fists tightening around their arms. They hadn't fought back, because they knew how that story ended. They had been thrown against the hood of their own car, their pockets searched without reason, their badges ignored as if they meant nothing. And then, the worst of it. Watts had leaned in close, his breath heavy with arrogance, and muttered, "You really think that badge makes you one of us?" He had laughed, shaking his head. "Nah. You're just another couple of nobodies who thought they could outrun what they are." The words had hit harder than the cuffs tightening around their wrists. Because they had spent years proving they were more than that. More than just another statistic. More than just bodies to be used, discarded, forgotten. And yet, in that moment, none of it had mattered. They were back to square one. The ride to the precinct had been long, humiliating, suffocating. The cops had made sure they heard every word, every joke, every reminder that this was their world, and the brothers were just visitors who had overstayed their welcome. But even through it all, Malcolm had kept one thing clear in his mind. This wasn't over. Because the mistake these officers had made, the only mistake that truly mattered, was assuming that they had picked the right victims. That Malcolm and Elijah Carter were just two more men to be chewed up by the system, spit out, forgotten. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that this story wasn't going to end the way they thought. And soon, very soon, they were going to find out. The precinct was a cold, suffocating place. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the linoleum floors that had been scuffed and dirted by countless footsteps, countless lives dragged through its doors, accused, broken, forgotten. Malcolm and Elijah sat in separate holding rooms, divided not just by concrete walls but by the weight of what was happening. The air was thick with the stink of injustice, the unshakable stench of a system that had already decided their fate before they had even stepped foot in that station. Officer Watts leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his smirk never fading. "Man, you boys look real uncomfortable in there," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "What happened? Thought y'all were untouchable. Thought that little badge of yours made you different." Elijah's jaw tightened. His fists clenched against his knees. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stand up, fight back, say something, but he knew better. That's what they wanted. They wanted a reaction, wanted him to snap, wanted him to confirm every twisted expectation they had in their heads. Malcolm, on the other hand, was still. Too still. His eyes hadn't left Watts since the moment they were thrown into this mess. Not in anger. Not in fear. Just calculation. He was watching, reading every move, every breath, every detail. Because this wasn't the end of their story. This was just another page. Watts chuckled, pushing off the doorframe and pacing slowly, like a predator circling its prey. "See, here's the thing," he continued, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "You're nobodies. Don't matter what papers you got in your wallet, don't matter who you work for. The second you got pulled over, you went right back to where you belong. And in about 24 hours, you're gonna be just another pair of black men with a record. Nobody's gonna come looking for you. Nobody's gonna care." Malcolm finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp. "You really believe that?" What stopped mid-step? His smirk faltered, just slightly. "Oh, I don't believe it," he said, flashing a grin again. "I know it." Greg Miller, the other officer, walked in then, holding a stack of papers. He dropped them onto the desk with an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head like he was so damn tired of dealing with people like them. "Paperwork's almost done," he muttered, glancing at Watts. "Prosecutor's gonna have them in front of a judge by the morning." Elijah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You guys really think you're untouchable, don't you?" Miller snorted. "What, you think some miracle's gonna save you? Think someone's gonna bust in here and put a stop to this? Please. The only thing coming for you is a long-ass sentence and a cell with a guy who doesn't give a damn where you used to work." Elijah tilted his head, a smirk flickering at the corner of his mouth. It was subtle, but Watts caught it. His eyes narrowed. "What the hell's funny?" Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, voice as smooth as steel. "You," he said. "You really don't see it, do you?" Watts stiffened. Miller's gaze darted between them, suddenly more aware of the shift in the room. It was subtle, like the first breeze before a storm. "You're too busy celebrating," Malcolm continued, his voice calm, steady, lethal, "to realize that you made a mistake." Watts scoffed, shaking his head. "A mistake? Nah, see, the only mistake here was y'all thinking you could step outside your lane." Malcolm exhaled, slow and controlled. "No, your mistake was thinking you had control of this situation." A pause. Something changed. The air shifted. Miller's fingers twitched slightly, and for the first time since this started, he didn't look so sure. Elijah leaned back against the cold metal chair, stretching his legs out like he was settling in for a show. "Tell me something, officer," he said casually. "How do you think this looks from the outside?" Watts frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You've got 2 federal agents in your holding cell," Elijah continued, rolling his shoulders. "Accused with 0 actual evidence. No surveillance footage, no physical proof, no victim statement, hell, the person we supposedly attacked hasn't even been identified. And yet, here we are." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but Malcolm cut him off. "How do you think that plays in a courtroom?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You really think a judge isn't going to notice how messy this whole thing is? Or do you think your prosecutor friend is gonna risk his career over two guys he doesn't even know? Watts laughed, but this time, it was forced. You really think your little FBI status is gonna save you? You're just another case to be processed. Malcolm stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. No, he murmured. We're the case that's going to take you down. Silence. A crack of uncertainty rippled through the room, invisible but undeniable. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Watts' smirk was still there, but it wasn't as confident as before. Elijah grinned. That's the thing about guys like you, he said, resting his arms behind his head. You get so comfortable in your power, so used to playing the game, that you don't even realize when you've already lost. Watts' face darkened. Shut the hell up. Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stared. Check your phone, he said. Miller blinked. What? Check. Your phone. Watts pulled his phone out of his pocket, unlocking the screen, and froze. Miller frowned, stepping closer. What's wrong? He glanced down, and his entire body went rigid. The news notification was still fresh, the headline blazing across the screen: FBI launches investigation into Atlanta Police Department, corruption allegations surface against multiple officers. Miller's lips parted. Watts' hands tightened around the phone. Malcolm's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the inevitable. You thought no one was coming, he murmured. You thought no one cared. But you forgot who we are. Elijah smirked. And you forgot what we do. The door slammed open. A new set of officers stormed in, badges visible, expressions unreadable. And suddenly, for the first time that night, Watts and Miller were the ones being watched. And they had no idea what was coming next. The courthouse was packed. The air was thick with tension, every seat filled with journalists, attorneys, officers, and civilians who had followed the story since it first broke. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with an anticipation that no one dared voice out loud. At the front of the room, just beyond the judge's bench, Officer Darren Watts and Officer Greg Miller sat with stiff postures, their faces no longer smug, no longer victorious. Gone were the smirks, the quiet chuckles of men who believed they were untouchable. In their place was a palpable fear, an unspoken realization sinking deeper with each passing second. They had walked into this courtroom believing the system would protect them, but now, for the first time, they weren't sure. Malcolm and Elijah sat just a few feet away, free, dressed sharply in suits that reflected exactly what they were, men in control of their fate, men who had never been broken. Malcolm's expression remained unreadable, his jaw set, his fingers laced together as he observed the room like a strategist overseeing a battlefield. Elijah, however, carried a small, knowing smirk, one that only deepened when Watts cast him a quick, uncertain glance. The judge entered, the gavel slamming against the wooden desk. This court is now in session. A hush fell over the room. The prosecution wasted no time, standing swiftly, adjusting his tie, and turning toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, pacing slowly, his voice calm but firm. What we have here today is not just another case of police misconduct. This is a case about systemic abuse, about corruption that has been left unchecked for too long. It is about power being misused against those it was meant to protect. And it is about two officers who believed they were above the very law they swore to uphold. Watts scoffed under his breath, shifting uncomfortably. Miller, on the other hand, sat frozen, his face pale. The prosecution continued, glancing briefly at Malcolm and Elijah. Two highly respected federal agents, men who have dedicated their careers to upholding justice, were targeted, humiliated, and falsely accused by these officers sitting before you today. Not because of a crime. Not because of evidence. But because of an abuse of power. The words hit like a hammer. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice steady, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "We have the recordings," he said simply. For the first time, Watts and Miller visibly tensed. There was a brief, deadly silence before the prosecution walked toward the evidence table, lifting a small, inconspicuous device. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a body recorder. One that was active the entire night these events took place. Every word, every action, every abuse of power is right here." Miller shifted in his seat. That doesn't prove anything," he muttered. The prosecutor didn't even look at him. "Let's find out, shall we?" He pressed play. The courtroom held its breath as the audio began. Static. Then footsteps. Then voices. "Man, you boys look real uncomfortable in there. Thought y'all were untouchable." What's voice, clear as day. Another voice, Elijah's. Calm. Controlled. Laced with quiet fury. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" Then Watts' reply, one that made even some of the jury members shift uncomfortably. "Nah. You're just another couple of nobodies who thought they could outrun what they are." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors, a woman in her 40s, visibly clenched her jaw, disgust flashing in her eyes. And then, the final nail in the coffin. Watts' voice again, arrogant, certain, dripping with superiority. "You really think the system gives a damn about you?" Silence. Miller's hands gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The judge leaned forward slightly, his face darkening. "Pause the tape," he ordered. The prosecutor obeyed. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The jury, the crowd, the reporters, all of them stared at Watts and Miller, their expressions shifting from neutral to something colder. The judge exhaled heavily, folding his hands in front of him. "Officer Watts," he said, voice measured. "Would you like to explain yourself?" Watts' mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came out. Malcolm leaned forward just slightly, locking eyes with him. His voice was quiet, deadly. "You thought no one was watching," he said. "But we were. And so was the law." Miller, in sheer panic, turned to his attorney. This is out of context." "That audio doesn't," the prosecutor cut him off swiftly. "We have more." He pressed play again. More words, more insults, more clear, undeniable evidence that these officers had never believed they would be caught. The court reporter's fingers flew over her keyboard, documenting every word, every damning statement that sealed their fate. Watts' breathing grew heavier, his once smug face now a mask of desperation. Miller, finally realizing the walls were caving in, turned abruptly to his lawyer. We can make a deal, right? There's something we can do." But it was already too late. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, given the overwhelming evidence, we request an immediate ruling on these charges." The judge sat back, his expression grim. He turned toward Watts and Miller, his eyes cold, piercing. "Officers, do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Silence. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, watching as the weight of their own corruption finally buried them. The judge nodded once. Then he spoke the words that sealed it all. "This court finds both defendants guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Whispers. The sounds of cameras clicking as the moment the system turned against its own abusers was forever recorded in history. And through it all, Malcolm and Elijah sat there, watching as the men who had once laughed at them were dragged away in cuffs. Elijah let out a breath, shaking his head with a small chuckle. "Damn," he muttered. "I love karma." Malcolm didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Justice had already spoken. And this time, it had been loud enough for the world to hear. The courtroom was still alive with murmurs, whispers threading through the rows of onlookers like wildfire. The weight of the verdict had settled heavily over the space, suffocating, undeniable. The once unshakable officers, Darren Watts and Greg Miller, now sat rigid in their seats, faces pale, hands clenched so tightly that their knuckles had turned stark white. The arrogance that had carried them through years of unchecked abuse had dissolved into sheer panic. Malcolm Carter let his gaze drift over them, his expression unreadable. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in his face, just a quiet understanding of what justice truly felt like. Beside him, Elijah exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the polished wooden table. The smirk that played at the edge of his lips wasn't one of celebration, but of relief, of knowing that for once, the system had worked the way it was meant to. What's shifted, his voice cracking when he finally spoke, low and trembling. "This is bullshit," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head, as if saying it out loud would somehow alter the reality he was now trapped in. "This whole thing is a goddamn setup." Malcolm's eyes flickered toward him, calm and sharp, the way a hunter watches prey moments before the kill. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, deliberate. "A setup?" He tilted his head slightly. "No, Watts. This is called accountability." Watts let out a dry, humorless chuckle, his hands clenching into fists. "Oh, you think you won, don't you?" His eyes, once so full of cruel amusement, now held a desperate edge. "You think this changes anything? You think people like me actually pay the price?" He gestured vaguely toward the jury, the cameras, the people watching, the weight of an entire nation hanging in the air. "They'll forget about this in a week. People like you get one victory and act like the world is different." Elijah let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" His voice was edged with something dangerous, something that held the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed, every moment of powerlessness he had ever felt. "You keep thinking this is about you." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that Watts had no choice but to hear every word. "This ain't about you, Watts. This is about every single person you did this to before us. Every person you pulled over just because you could. Every family you tore apart with your lies. Every life you ruined thinking no one would ever hold you accountable." Watts' jaw clenched. He had no answer to that. Miller finally found his voice, but it was shaking, stripped of the confidence he had once carried like a shield. We didn't force the system to work this way," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. "We just played by the rules. We did what everyone else does." Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze hardened. "That's the problem," he said, his voice razor sharp. "You thought just because it was always done this way, it was right. You thought just because no one stopped you before, no one ever would." He exhaled, slow, controlled. "You were wrong." Miller swallowed, his throat bobbing visibly. The reality of the situation was sinking in now, creeping into the very core of who they were. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, but now they were just two men in suits, waiting for a sentence that had already been decided. The judge cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the murmurs still buzzing through the crowd. "Officers Watts and Miller, you have been found guilty on all counts, and sentencing will proceed immediately." A hush fell over the courtroom. Watts stiffened, his breath coming in sharp, shallow inhales. His shoulders hunched forward as if the weight of those words had physically struck him. He turned toward his attorney, but the man wouldn't meet his eyes. Malcolm and Elijah didn't move. They simply watched. The judge's voice remained steady, unwavering. "Considering the severity of the charges, and the clear abuse of power displayed in this case, the court sentences both defendants to 15 years in federal prison." The silence that followed was deafening. Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes flickered toward the officers stationed by the exit, waiting to take them away, and the reality finally broke through. Watts, on the other hand, let out a low, strangled laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. You think this means anything? His voice was strained, tight with something between rage and desperation. You think putting me behind bars changes the way this country works? He scoffed, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a grimace. You think cops like me aren't gonna keep doing exactly what we did? Elijah's gaze darkened. Not if we have anything to do with it. The bailiff stepped forward, gripping Watson Miller's arms. Watt struggled briefly, his pride still clinging to him like a dying flame, but it was over. His power had been stripped, his fate sealed. As they were led out, Malcolm finally spoke one last time, his voice even, unwavering. You asked if this means anything, he said. It does. Watts turned his head slightly, but Malcolm was no longer looking at him. He was looking at the dozens of people in the room, the jurors, the reporters, the everyday citizens who had watched every second of this trial unfold. It means the next time someone like you thinks they can get away with it, they'll remember today. Watts' face twisted with something unspoken, but he didn't reply. Because he had nothing left to say. The doors swung open, and then they were gone. Elijah let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw, his body finally relaxing in a way it hadn't in days. Well, he muttered, shaking his head with a small, exhausted chuckle. That was something. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He simply looked down at his hands, hands that had once been in cuffs, hands that had almost been erased by a system that had never wanted to let them in. But they were here. Still standing. Still breathing. Still fighting. And now? Now they had won. Elijah nudged him slightly. Come on, he said. Let's get the hell out of here. Malcolm finally exhaled, pushing back his chair. As they stood, the whispers of the crowd turned into something else entirely, respect, acknowledgement, a recognition of what had just happened. Because justice, real justice, had been served. And for the first time in a long time, Malcolm and Elijah Carter walked out of that courthouse as free men, undefeated, unbroken, and more powerful than ever. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse slammed shut behind them, sealing in the chaos they had just left behind. For the first time in days, Malcolm and Elijah Carter stepped into the open air, but it didn't feel like freedom. The world outside hadn't changed just because justice had been served in a single case. The city of Atlanta still moved with its relentless pace, car horns blaring in the distance, neon signs flashing their advertisements into the night, and the ever-present hum of sirens wailing somewhere, always somewhere. Elijah drew in a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if trying to physically expel the weight of everything they had just endured. The trial was over. The sentence had been handed down. Watts and Miller were going to prison for what they had done. They had won. And yet, as he stood there on the courthouse steps, watching the last few reporters pack up their cameras, watching people walk past them as if none of it had ever happened, the victory felt incomplete. Like a single battle won in a war that had only just begun. I should feel relieved, Elijah muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he ran a hand over his short curls. His voice was quiet, like he was talking to himself as much as he was to Malcolm. Should feel like we did something today. But it don't feel like that. Feels like, he trailed off, searching for the right words, but they refused to come. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He stood beside his brother, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored suit, eyes scanning the street like he was still analyzing a crime scene, looking for what was out of place, what wasn't adding up. Finally, he nodded once, barely moving. Yeah, he said simply. Feels like it ain't over. Elijah let out a low, bitter chuckle, kicking at a loose pebble on the pavement. Because it ain't, he muttered. You and I both know that. His voice was sharp now, edged with frustration. He looked around, taking in the city, the courthouse behind them, the world that had just witnessed a rare moment where the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening for just a second before he spoke. It ain't over, he agreed, finally shifting his gaze to meet his brother's. Because Watts and Miller. They weren't the disease. They were just symptoms. Elijah nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders never leaving. Yeah, he muttered, licking his lips as he glanced toward the street. And you know what happens when you cut out part of something rotten. The rest of it just gets smarter. The next ones cover their tracks better. Make sure they don't get caught slippin'. Malcolm didn't respond immediately, but he didn't have to. They both knew how this worked. They had seen it before, time and time again. The system wasn't built to break. It was built to adjust, to shift its weight, to let go of the people who got caught but protect everyone else who stayed quiet. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him from his thoughts. He frowned as he pulled it out, glancing down at the screen. A message. Unknown number. His brow furrowed. He turned the screen toward Malcolm, who took one look at the words and let out a slow, measured breath. You think this is a win? Be careful what you start. Some things don't just disappear. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened instinctively. His heart didn't race. His breath didn't hitch. He had expected something like this. But that didn't mean it didn't piss him off. You see this shit? Elijah muttered, his voice low, dangerous. He shoved the phone toward Malcolm again as if his brother hadn't already read it. They really think we're just gonna walk away from this? Malcolm didn't blink, didn't flinch. He took the phone, scanned the message again, then handed it back. His face was unreadable, but Elijah knew his brother well enough to see what was happening beneath the surface. Expected it, Malcolm finally said, his voice even. Elijah let out a sharp breath through his nose, shaking his head. Yeah, well, I ain't just expecting it. I'm pissed. Malcolm's eyes flickered slightly, something thoughtful shifting in his expression. He turned his gaze back to the courthouse, back to the doors that still loomed behind them. They're hoping we're too tired to keep pushing, he murmured. Elijah scoffed. Tired? Man, I'm just getting started. Malcolm was quiet for a beat. Then he turned to face his brother fully, his posture solid, his voice calm but carrying something undeniable, unshakable. No more waiting, Malcolm said. We don't just fight back. We change the game. Elijah's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied his brother's face. And how the hell do we do that? Malcolm's jaw tightened. His mind was already moving, already putting the pieces together, already thinking steps ahead like he always did. He wasn't just thinking about Watts and Miller anymore. He was thinking about everyone like them, the ones who hadn't been caught, the ones who were still out there, still protected, still dangerous. We stopped playing by their rules, Malcolm said finally. Elijah let the words settle in, rolling them around in his mind like dice in a gambler's hand. He had spent his whole life playing by the rules, bending them just enough to survive but never stepping so far over the line that he couldn't come back. But Malcolm was right. The rules were made to protect the people who designed the game. And if they wanted real change, they had to be willing to do what the people before them hadn't. A slow, knowing grin spread across Elijah's face. Now you're talking, he muttered, shaking his head slightly. Malcolm didn't smile. He wasn't in the mood for celebration. Because this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And they weren't going to stop until the whole damn system felt it. Elijah leaned against the hood of the car, arms crossed tightly, shoulders tense, his mind still running at full speed even though the courtroom had been left behind. The city stretched out in front of them, bright lights flickering in the distance, traffic moving along as if nothing had happened, as if the past few weeks of their lives hadn't been a battlefield where their very existence had been put on trial. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, the reality that they had won this time but that the war itself was far from over. His entire body still buzzed with adrenaline, a restless energy that wouldn't settle no matter how many deep breaths he took, no matter how many times he told himself that they had done what needed to be done. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Because even as he stood there, breathing in the Atlanta night, he knew there were still more like Watts and Miller out there, men in uniforms, sitting in precincts, sipping coffee and waiting for their next victims, waiting for the next chance to twist the law into a weapon and use it against the very people they had sworn to protect. Malcolm was a few steps away, his back straight, phone in hand, his face unreadable as he scrolled through messages, checking updates, making sure there were no loose ends. He was always like this after a case, after a mission, always looking for what came next, never allowing himself to believe that a single victory meant they had won the war. Elijah envied that sometimes, the way Malcolm could keep himself in check, the way he never let his emotions spill out the way Elijah did, the way he always seemed to be 10 steps ahead, already thinking about the next move before anyone else had even processed what just happened. Elijah had never been built like that. He felt things immediately, raw and unfiltered, like an open flame that refused to be put out. He had spent years trying to control it, trying to teach himself to be as collected as his brother, but moments like this reminded him that some fires weren't meant to be contained. His eyes flicked back toward the street, watching the last of the reporters disperse, their cameras packed away, their attention shifting toward the next headline, the next scandal, the next name they could plaster across a breaking news banner. That was how this worked, one moment of outrage, one burst of attention, then silence. The system thrived on people moving on people forgetting. The problem wasn't just men like Watts and Miller. It was everything. The way the system absorbed damage and kept moving, the way it sacrificed its own when necessary but never truly changed, the way it counted on people getting tired, on people choosing to walk away instead of digging deeper. He exhaled sharply, breaking the silence between them. You know they're already working on burying this, right? His voice was low, sharp, frustration threading through every word. You know they're sitting in some office right now, figuring out how to make this go away, how to make sure something like this never happens again. To them, this wasn't justice, Malcolm. This was a problem they need to clean up before it spreads. Malcolm didn't look up from his phone. Yeah. I know. Elijah scoffed, shaking his head. Then why do you look like you're still waiting for the other shoe to drop? Malcolm finally lowered his phone, locking eyes with his brother. Because I am. Elijah clenched his jaw, his frustration deepening. You think there's more coming? Malcolm didn't hesitate. I think the people who benefited from Watts and Miller being on the force don't like loose ends. And right now? We're the biggest loose ends they've ever had. Elijah let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Man, I swear. It's like no matter how many times we prove ourselves, no matter how many times we fight back, they always find a way to make us the problem. Like we're the ones who disrupted the natural order of things, like we're the ones who went too far, when all we ever did was refuse to let them get away with the shit they've been doing for years. Malcolm's expression hardened slightly, his voice quieter but no less firm. Because to them, we are the problem. Not because we did something wrong, but because we did something they didn't expect. We weren't supposed to win. We weren't supposed to fight back. We were supposed to take it, just like every other person they've done this to. And the fact that we didn't? That's a problem for them. Elijah let the words settle in, rolling them over in his mind like he was trying to make sense of a puzzle where the pieces would never quite fit. So what now? Malcolm's gaze drifted toward the city again, toward the skyline stretching out before them, toward the streets that had shaped them, the same streets that had nearly swallowed them whole. He knew what came next, even if Elijah hadn't fully realized it yet. This wasn't over, and it was never going to be over if they didn't do something more than just react. Finally, he turned back to his brother, his jaw set, his voice steady. We dig deeper. Elijah arched a brow, crossing his arms. What, into the case? Malcolm shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Into the system that let it happen in the first place. Elijah whistled low, his expression unreadable for a moment before he shook his head with something between amusement and disbelief. Damn. You really trying to burn it all down, huh? Malcolm didn't waver. No. I'm trying to make sure we don't spend the rest of our lives putting out the same fire over and over again while they keep lighting new ones behind our backs. Elijah let out a breath, tilting his head back to stare up at the sky, as if looking for some kind of answer in the stars. You do realize that the deeper we go, the more dangerous this gets, right? This ain't just Watts and Miller anymore. We start pulling at these threads, and we're gonna find things we can't walk away from. Malcolm didn't even blink. We've already made enemies, Elijah. The question is how many more we're willing to make. Elijah stayed quiet for a long moment, letting the weight of those words settle between them. He had never been afraid of enemies. Hell, he had made plenty over the years. But this? This wasn't just about them anymore. This wasn't just about two brothers who had fought back and won. This was about every single person who never got the chance to fight. The ones who didn't have resources, who didn't have the power, who didn't have someone looking out for them. The ones who had been erased before anyone ever had the chance to say their names out loud. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another message. You're making a mistake. This isn't your fight. Walk away while you still can. Elijah turned the screen toward Malcolm, his grip tightening around the device, his jaw clenching. Still think we don't have their attention? Malcolm barely glanced at the phone before meeting his brother's eyes, his expression unreadable but his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous certainty. I think they don't understand who they're dealing with. Elijah snorted, shaking his head as something slow and knowing settled into his chest. Guess we should remind them. Malcolm nodded once. Yeah. We should. And just like that, a decision was made. They had come too far to back down now. And if the system thought it could intimidate them into walking away, it was about to learn just how wrong it was. Elijah sat in the passenger seat of the car, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee, his mind still running at full speed. The streetlights flashed by in streaks of white and gold, their glow reflecting off the windshield as Malcolm drove through the city, his grip firm on the wheel, his expression unreadable. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the courthouse, but the weight of everything hung between them like an unspoken conversation, thick with tension and the knowledge that this wasn't over. The city kept moving, indifferent to what had happened, indifferent to the fact that two crooked cops had finally faced justice, indifferent to the fact that, in some ways, it felt like a victory and a loss at the same time. Elijah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You know what pisses me off the most? His voice cut through the silence, low and sharp, filled with something bitter, frustrated, raw. He turned his head slightly, watching Malcolm's profile, the way his brother's jaw tightened just slightly, but he kept his eyes on the road. It's not even that Watts and Miller thought they could do this to us. It's that they've done it before. So many times. And you know what? They weren't scared. Not even a little bit. They weren't worried about getting caught, because the system was built to protect them. And you know what that means, Malcolm? It means there are so many more like them. Malcolm's fingers flexed slightly around the wheel, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. I know. Elijah scoffed, turning back toward the window, the city blurring past him. Yeah, I know you know. But that's the thing, man. We've always known. We've seen it up close, seen how it works, seen how people like them walk away every damn time. And maybe, just maybe, this one time, they didn't. But you think that really scared the rest of them? You think the ones still out there, the ones who covered for Watts and Miller, the ones who looked the other way when they were planting evidence or roughing up some kid for no reason, you think they're sitting at home, shaking in their boots? He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Nah. They're regrouping. They're figuring out how to close the gaps, how to make sure this never happens again. How to make sure next time, nobody catches them slipping. Malcolm's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly before he exhaled, rolling his shoulders back, releasing the tension in a slow, controlled motion. You're right, he said simply. They're not scared. Yet. Elijah turned his head, watching Malcolm's profile, the way his expression never wavered, the way he spoke with the certainty of a man who had already decided what came next. There was something in his brother's voice, something final, something that sent a slow, electric pulse through Elijah's chest. Elijah let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke again. And what about us, huh? What's our next move? You said we dig deeper. But how deep are we talking, Malcolm? His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He made a turn, the tires humming against the pavement, the city stretching out before them in endless possibilities, endless dangers. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, deliberate. Deep enough that they can't cover it up. Deep enough that when we pull this thing apart, there's no putting it back together again. Elijah let out a low breath, his fingers curling into his lap. Damn, he muttered, shaking his head. You really trying to blow the whole thing open, huh? Malcolm's jaw clenched for just a second before he spoke. I'm trying to make sure the next time someone like us gets pulled over, they don't have to wonder if it's their last day on the outside. Elijah sat with that for a moment, rolling his tongue over his teeth, his mind replaying every moment of that night, the flashing lights in the rearview mirror, the way Watts had smiled like he had already won, the cold, sharp snap of the cuffs around his wrists, the humiliation of it all. He had been angry then, so angry he could barely see straight. But now? Now he wasn't just angry. He was focused. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, another unknown number, another message. You're making a mistake. This isn't your fight. Walk away while you still can. Elijah stared at the screen for a long moment before tilting it toward Malcolm. Still think we don't have their attention? Malcolm barely glanced at the phone before his eyes flicked back to the road. I think they don't understand who they're dealing with. Elijah snorted, shaking his head. Guess we should remind them. Malcolm nodded once, his grip tightening slightly around the wheel. Yeah. We should. The city stretched out before them, endless, waiting. They had spent their whole lives learning how to navigate it, how to survive in a system that wasn't built for them, how to fight back even when the fight seemed impossible. But now? Now they weren't just fighting back. Now they were taking control. The city didn't change overnight. The system didn't crumble just because 2 corrupt cops had been taken down. The streets still pulsed with the same rhythm, the same shadows lurking in the corners, waiting for the next opportunity to consume the unwary. But something was different now. Something subtle yet undeniable. A shift in the air, in the way people spoke about justice, in the way those in power watched their steps just a little more carefully. Malcolm and Elijah had set something in motion, something that couldn't be undone. Malcolm stood in front of the glass window of an office that now belonged to him, the city skyline stretching out in front of him, the weight of everything resting on his shoulders, but for the first time, it wasn't a weight that threatened to crush him. It was one he was ready to carry. After everything, after all the fights, the trial, the threats, and the whispers in the dark warning them to walk away, they had not only survived, they had won. Not just in the courtroom, not just against Watts and Miller, but against the very forces that had tried to silence them. Because in the aftermath of it all, when the dust had settled, the headlines had changed. What had started as just another case of police corruption had turned into something far greater. The federal investigation into the department had expanded. Names had surfaced, bigger names, more powerful names. Officers who had thought they were untouchable found themselves sitting in interrogation rooms instead of behind their desks. And the deeper it went, the uglier it got. Bribes, cover-ups, entire networks of corruption unraveling thread by thread. The city was watching now. The public wasn't letting this one go. And Malcolm had made sure of that. Elijah walked into the office, his hands tucked into his pockets, that same fire still burning in his eyes. You see the reports, he asked, his voice edged with satisfaction. More arrests. Another precinct under investigation. It's spreading, man. They can't stop it now. Malcolm nodded, exhaling slowly. They're trying, though, he said, glancing down at the thick files stacked on his desk. They're fighting back in every way they can. Pressure on politicians, threats against journalists, even tried to throw out some of the cases on technicalities. He looked up at Elijah then, his expression firm. But they're losing ground. Elijah let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Damn right, they are. And you know why? He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. Because we didn't just take down 2 cops, Malcolm. We exposed the whole damn system. And now, people ain't looking away. Malcolm allowed himself the smallest hint of a smirk. No, they're not. But just because the system was being exposed didn't mean the fight was over. There were still those who wanted to silence them. The threats hadn't stopped. The warnings kept coming. Walk away while you still can. You don't know what you're dealing with. But none of it mattered now. They had gone too far, done too much. Walking away wasn't an option. And then there was Watts and Miller. Prison had stripped them of everything, their power, their influence, their sense of invincibility. But the world was small on the inside. And it had a long memory. They had made enemies long before they ever crossed paths with Malcolm and Elijah. And now? Now they had no badges to hide behind. No shield to protect them. Elijah had watched the footage when it leaked, a prison surveillance clip of Watts, sitting in the yard, no smirk, no arrogance, just a man who had finally realized he wasn't above the system he had once controlled. Malcolm hadn't bothered to watch. He didn't need to. He had known from the start that karma would take care of them. But that wasn't their focus anymore. Their focus was on what came next. People are asking what we're gonna do now, Elijah said after a moment, watching Malcolm carefully. A lot of folks think we should just take the win and move on. Malcolm glanced at him, one brow slightly raised. Move on to what? Elijah grinned. Exactly. Because this wasn't just about one victory. It wasn't just about 2 corrupt cops going down. This was about making sure it didn't happen again. About making sure that the next time someone in power thought they could abuse it, they'd think twice. Malcolm and Elijah weren't just 2 men who had fought back and won. They were the ones who had changed the game. And the game wasn't over yet. Sometimes justice comes in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in the form of headlines, arrests, investigations that spiral so deep they bring down the very people who built the system to protect themselves. And sometimes justice comes when the people who thought they could get away with it finally realize they can't. But this story isn't just about Malcolm and Elijah. This is about every person who has ever been silenced. Every person who has ever been told to back down, to walk away, to accept the world the way it is. It's about the ones who fought back and the ones who never got the chance to. Because the truth is, the system doesn't change unless you make it change. So now, I want to ask you, what would you have done? Would you have fought back? Would you have risked everything, knowing the system was designed to keep you from winning? And more importantly, now that you've heard this story, now that you know the truth, what will you do with it? Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. And if you believe in justice, if you believe in truth, if you believe in stories that matter, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the next story, you won't want to miss it.